Thank you so much for joining the show, Natalie. It's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you, Katie. I'm pleased to be here.
I'm super passionate about the topic that seems to be your core topic, which is around creativity. So I'm really looking forward to diving in more deeply into this topic. But I guess first things first, because everyone has different views and definitions of creativity. What's your definition of creativity?
My definition of creativity is that it is our ability to toggle between wonder and rigor to solve problems, generate novel value, and produce meaning. And I wrote about this in a book called The Creativity Leap. I spent a lot of time thinking this through because in the early years of building my company, Figure Eight Thinking, I was getting invited into big corporate environments to help them build cultures of innovation. And in the midst of that, I just kept having this nagging sense that we were starting in the wrong place. The place we should be starting is to build a creative capacity for leaders, for teams. But the challenge, especially at that time, I think it's a little less so now, but it's still a challenge, is that if I were to say, hey guys, we should start by building our capacity for creativity, they would look at me like I had three heads because they would think, oh, creativity is something that artists do, or I'm not creative because I can't draw, dance, sing, paint, etc. And so that's where I started really digging into my own research to understand a more accessible, simple way to democratize creativity. And I think that if you think about it as toggling between wonder and rigor to solve problems and produce novel value and generate meaning, then you quickly realize that the best lawyers, doctors, coders, farmers, etc., are super creative when they're toggling between wonder and rigor.
Amazing. And I've never heard these two words put together. And it reminds me that I really love what I call magic, which is really these insights and creativity and living with intention. And I love discipline. One of the core programs I lead is called mindful self-discipline. So I've just seen, like, in my head, as you're talking, I'm already getting an epiphany and thinking, oh yeah, wonder and rigor. Maybe tell us a bit more where you came up with this concept of wonder and rigor and what that means for you.
Yes, it was actually, as you, I'm sure, are quite aware of, research is not linear. It is not a nice, neat, straight line. It's about following the breadcrumbs. You think you're interested in this area over here, and then there's some interesting little quirky observation or insight that happens. And so at the time, so just for context, I had used to be a professor. I have a very diverse background in cultural anthropology and fashion and academia. And my doctoral research is something that I completed while I was still working full-time as a professor. And that really helped me to dive deeply into improvisation and improvisational organizations. Well, after I completed my PhD, I launched a strategic design MBA program for the university where I taught. And I would have guest speakers come in to share with my MBA students their career journeys. And whenever I would have entrepreneurs, I kept observing that they would say things like, something told me not to do the deal, or something told me to work with her and not him. And it was really interesting to me because while I had created, with the help of some colleagues, a very atypical MBA program, we were integrating design thinking and how people were learning strategy, finance, leadership. I was in the midst of a lot of very traditional thinking colleagues. And I thought, this is so interesting. Here they are, very successful entrepreneurs, business leaders, and they keep referring to this very vague occurrence that was significant, where it was a feeling. I said to myself, I think they're talking about intuition. Well, that led to me deciding I would like to do a micro ethnography, that's how I put it, on intuitive leadership. I wanted to understand where intuition shows up for people to make strategic decisions. And so in my little micro ethnography, I decided to look at dancer choreographers, first responders, chefs, and DJs, because my assumption, my hypothesis was that these are people, DJs, chefs, first responders, dancer, choreographers, who are following that nudge as they were making strategic decisions. Well, in the process of doing an observational study of a local Philadelphia modern ballet dance company called Ballet X, it was apparent to me that the way the dancers worked was full of, and I got to this word later, wonder, right? It was full of a lot of way finding that was very intuitive, inspiration, in the moment, awe, deep curiosity. Those are the ways I describe wonder. It's about awe and deep curiosity and pausing and big blue sky thinking. But I was observing in the process of looking at these rehearsals that there was something else there in the creative process. It wasn't all just head in the clouds. You just really see this with professional dancers, right? The physical demands in their bodies requires, they got to where they are because they have incredible discipline. Their bodies literally reflect that out. And so it was in the process of doing this microethnography on intuition that really led me down this path of trying to understand creativity in these two dimensions that they weren't in tension with one another. They weren't in contrast. They were actually quite complementary. And that led me to land on these ideas of wonder and rigor, and to really work at offering this as a provocation for people. Because I'm sure, Katie, you also have observed that people sometimes think that creativity is, oh, it's doing whatever you feel like. That's not actually what creativity is. And if you have had an artistic practice in music or dance or visual arts, you are so aware that before you can do all the free flowing cool stuff, you have to learn the rules. You have to know the discipline. You need to know the boundaries and the technique so that you can rebound off of them. And what's interesting is that while I lead with this definition that creativity is our ability to toggle between wonder and rigor to solve problems, later I revisited my older practice and work in improvisation and then intuition, and later inquiry or curiosity to develop the 3I framework. So while wonder and rigor is kind of my definition of creativity, when people need help with, well, how am I going to consistently and sustainably toggle between wonder and rigor, that's when I offer the 3Is. That's how you activate it consistently, is through improvisation, inquiry, and intuition. So it's just really interesting how some this work was not linear at all. Some of the ideas that were kind of percolating years earlier came back to scaffold and support the practice in other ways.
That's beautifully explained. And I love the example of the dancers, both with the awe and then the rigor needed to actually make it happen. And 200%, if you have any form of creative interest and hobbies, I play instruments and dance and all of that. Yes, it does require the rigor, the discipline, the learning the rules, the hours of practice before you can free flow with it. So it's true that it's a misconception.
Yes. And Katie, let me just say, I would just amend a little bit what you said and say, if you have any kind of creative endeavor, if you have any kind of artistic endeavor, right? Because to me, we are all hardwired to be creative. We're not all hardwired to be artists, just like we're not all hardwired to be scientists or engineers or explorers, but we all are hardwired to be creative. The challenge is that, especially in where I'm from, the United States and Western American society, we conflate creativity only with art or only with design. And I don't think that's fair to artists, nor is it beneficial to our society at large. So yeah, if you have any kind of artistic endeavor, you absolutely have experienced this. But I think we all are creative. It's just a matter, are you being intentional about practicing to optimize your creative capacity?
Yes, that's a fantastic distinction. And it makes me think of how being an engineer can be, highly creative, and being a chef and being pretty much any job, it's like you say, requires some creativity, which is that non-linear thinking and that toggling. I'm also curious because I'm sure many people listening to you right now will think, how can I have more of this wonder and awe? Because I feel that it's something that we all more or less naturally have, I think, as children, and somehow gets diminished if we don't cultivate it or work on it. So how can we have this open blue sky that you mentioned?
Well, I agree with you. I think that as we observe in our own children, if we think back to our own childhood, we had no problem being experimental and improvisational and listening to that gut instinct. We didn't always have the words to explain rationally, but we just instinctively, intuitively moved on it. We were full of questions, right? Sometimes our parents, our teachers want us to kind of dim down the questions. One of the things that I've observed starts to stem that, unfortunately, is our educational systems. And too many educational systems, we educate towards solutions, what's the answer, versus what are multiple possible future scenarios? What are multiple possible ways we could be approaching this challenge, this problem? And so instead of falling in love with the process, falling in love with the problem, we are educated more and more. No. Figure out what's an answer that we can just feel so secure about. Of course, then we get out into the working world, and that gets repeated where our employers want us to have, great answers and solutions, and that becomes very myopic, and we often lose sight of opportunities in whatever field you're working in. And if it's nonprofit, for-profit, business, science, healthcare, education, you lose sight of paying attention to the people who are consuming your products, your experiences, and your services. So one of the tips and techniques I consistently advise people to do, which actually will help you in your work life as well as your personal life, is to become a clumsy student of anything. And here's why that's important. So first of all, what do I mean by becoming a clumsy student? It's really important that you have some activity, endeavor in your life where you are not the smartest person in the room, where you are super clumsy, you don't really know what you're doing, you feel awkward, you're learning. For me, it's ballroom dance. So I studied dance since I was 4 years old, never studied ballroom dance, and only really consistently got into ballroom dance about 3 years ago. And whether for you it's auto mechanics or coding or gardening or playing a musical instrument, whatever it is, when you are a clumsy student of something, you are rewiring the neural synapses in your brain, and you are normalizing the ability to be okay with asking a question. You get a lot better at listening to and following that intuition. Intuition is pattern recognition. It's like a muscle or a sonar. So the more we use it, the stronger and louder and clearer it gets. The more we ignore it, the flabbier and dimmer it gets. You also get a lot better at being experimental and improvising. Improvisation is about experimentation, saying yes, and it's about the build, right? Without necessarily knowing what the end goal is going to be. It's about being deeply rooted in the present. So what I have experienced is that in the spaces in my life where I'm a clumsy student, because I get more confident about not knowing the answer, about being okay with trying something new, asking questions, I am rewiring those neural synapses in my brain that aren't just focused on the frontal neocortex cognitive load, but are also in deeper dimensions and recesses of my brain, so that when I show up to client work, I'm a lot better at wonder and rigor because I've been practicing it in different areas of my life. So that is a really great way to get better at building your creative capacity, is becoming a clumsy student in some other dimension of your life.
Yes, that makes perfect sense. And it also helps with things like fear of failure, being resilient, stepping out of your comfort zone. I mean, the list goes on, and it's really widens the perspective that we have on different aspects of life, and then work, and it goes on to work. I'm also curious, and this is maybe more personally something that I've lived in my work, and I'm sure other people who have similar fields maybe will resonate with this, which is that if you use your creative muscle a lot in your business, which I'm sure most entrepreneurs listening have dealt with this. I've sometimes found that it sort of dried up in my personal life. And one way of looking at it, for instance, is I wrote quite a lot of nonfiction, so blog posts, LinkedIn posts, my book on nonfiction book coming out soon. And I found that it prevented me or blocked me from writing fiction. I recently started again, which I'm really happy, and I've been writing some short stories. It's recently redeveloped, mostly through Rigor and me realizing how much I missed it. What I'm wondering is, have you found or seen that people that use a lot this creativity muscle, after a while, either go through sort of mini creative burnout and can't produce any more content, for instance, or it impacts their creativity or maybe artistic endeavors, for example, in their private life?
Yeah, I think that's it. Those are all great concerns and their realities. And I think that it points out that we constantly must be in a learning mode, right? Because another way a lot of people have defined creativity is that it's about juxtaposition of things that have previously never been put together. I call it a mashup or a remix, right? There's a chapter in my book, The Creativity Leap, where I talk about how there's really not anything new under the sun. What is new is the way people choose to juxtapose or do a mashup of things that previously were never put together. And so something like the iPhone or a smartphone device, it's a mashup of a telephone and a calendar and email system, right? Someone said, what if, right? So being able to expose yourself to new environments, to new people is super important to reduce that burnout. And it's also important to pay attention to when you realize you're starting to dry up, things are not as inspiring or exciting to you. There's an incredible amount of self-awareness that is required among people who commit to building their creative capacity and honesty about where they are in the work. And so being able to expose yourself to new environments, new people, doesn't mean you need to be able to travel to far off exotic locales or have zillions of friends or colleagues. It means that maybe you read, to kind of build on one of your early points, maybe you read more fiction, because fiction builds curiosity, and curiosity is the foundation for building empathy. When I read a work of fiction, I get to try on a different gender, a different ethnicity, a different time in the world, a different time and place. I realized one of the reasons I loved reading fairy tales when I was a little girl is that they put me in such a totally different environment than what my current reality was. And I would think, oh my gosh, I would be so cold if I was only wearing that little dress that's in the picture and all this snow is coming down. What would I do next? And then you get a chance to imagine and to dream, right? I wrote a piece for it's either Katie Couric Media or She Media about micro retreats, and I kind of categorized them in terms of noticing retreats. It was actually for She Media. It was about noticing retreats. It was about being able to go into a neighborhood in your own town or city that you rarely frequent and take a walk through there, a walking retreat. I don't know about in Stockholm. I'm sure it's very true there as well. I would like to go one day. But in Philadelphia, we are a city of neighborhoods, and the neighborhoods are very distinctive in terms of the housing architecture, the number of trees, the lack of trees, the way people use their front steps, or the way they use their backyard, the way people decorate, right? And just immersing yourself in a different environment, going to a cafe and having a cup of tea or coffee and just people watching, right? These are all ways that you can put yourself into a new circumstance, a new environment. And what does that do? It helps to spark questions, because as Ian Leslie, who wrote a great book called Curious, he reminds us that curiosity is the product of an information gap. Curiosity is not the product of knowing nothing, zero about something. You need to know just a little bit about something to be curious. So you overhear this conversation, or you see a younger woman and an older woman interacting. you begin to wonder, what is the relationship? You could have a one day a month where you go into a cafe and you just, draft up a short story based on observations that you make. But the more you think about this, you can dream up your own ways of putting yourself in new environments, exposing yourself to new and different people that will help you to begin to juxtapose new things. That's the wonder that's coming out of that deep curiosity. The rigor is about committing to, how do I now integrate these new insights into my work?
Yes, I love that. And it's really about this openness and like that big blue sky that you mentioned. It reminds me of what Julia Cameron talks about in The Artist's Way with the artist date. And when I read The Artist's Way, which really helped me to finish my nonfiction book on focus, I was really doing the morning pages every day, which really helped with the not censoring, not judging, open, but I didn't do the artist dates. So now I'm thinking maybe that's also something to explore.
Yeah, totally.
What have you noticed as some of the blockages and the obstacles? Because that's one example, for instance, in my life where I wasn't doing the artist dates, but what are some of the blockages that you've noticed when you coach C-suite and leaders around creativity?
A lot of it is very much inside out work. So much of it has to do with that. I call it the negative Nancy voice inside of me. So in my writing process, the negative Nancy voice is, oh, that was so stupid. Why would you say it like that? No one's going to read that. Oh, this is so awful. That's a very funny narrative. And then I have to put the uplifting, my better angel on my other shoulder that says, oh, that's so interesting. What happens next? Oh, say more. Oh, what if you then start thinking about XYZ, right? So that negative Nancy is kind of the mopey teenager me. And the excited one is the very excited, enthusiastic elementary school version of me that was much more open to all sorts of possibilities. So first, self-awareness that this is even going on, right? And next, dimming out that negative Nancy voice. Because why is that true? Says who, right? So suspend judgment, clamp that one down, and pump up the one that's full of much more enthusiasm and excitement. The other thing I think we have to remind ourselves is to not take ourselves so seriously. Like, just try it. And I think for me, that's often a block. The other piece that I really pay attention to is the space-time continuum. So I pay a lot of attention to the design of my space. For me, having orderly, cleared out space really affects my mind and my ability to think more expansively. So that works for me. Doesn't work for that doesn't matter for every single person, but whatever the spatial environment is for you, the spatial environment that you need to do your most productive work. And then in terms of time, I learned early on that it was a fool's errand for me to block out my calendar and say, okay, for all day on Wednesday, I'm just going to write. I would find I need to do some dishes. Oh, let me go out here and water these plants over here a little bit more. So I tend to work in what I call rigor sprints. And I give myself very succinct amounts of time where I'm pushing through and there's no distraction. And I, as you already said, I don't edit myself. I'm talking about writing really right now, right? But whatever the work is you have to do, giving yourself that focused, succinct, and distinct amount of time to do the work is really important, because the other thing you'll begin to observe is there's so much you can actually get done in a short amount of time. And breaks, please take breaks. One of the challenges in our organizations today is that people are struggling with incredible amounts of burnout. They're going from meeting to meeting, Zoom to Zoom. And my next book is spending a lot of time talking about something I call invisible work. It's not the gendered invisible work. I wrote about this in an article for Fast Company, that our most productive selves are not when we're churning through email or on a Zoom meeting. They're when we step away from the computer and we engage in activity that sparks different neural synapses in the different regions of our brain, not the neofrontal cortex, so that the juicy bits, the juicy ideas begin to synchronize. And those activities include daydreaming, movement, like going for a walk, engaging in meaningful conversation, reading a work of fiction, doing work that has seemingly nothing to do with the work at hand. How often have you discovered when you go for, it doesn't have to be a 30-minute walk, a 5-minute walk, and you come back to your desk, things click. All of a sudden, you're able to synchronize ideas better. So that invisible work is also really important to do in our organizations, and making sure we commit to that individually as well.
So wonderful to hear someone else preach breaks and walks.
Yes,
And I
pause. Please pause.
Because I do a lot of work around focus. My company's the Focus Bee, and all the time when people wanted a quick, short tip on how to be more focused, I'd say breaks, like single task, breaks, lunch walks, and I'd say it over and over and over again.
Yes, you're right. I agree with you 1,000%.
So that's so nice to hear. And I love seeing it not only from the focus perspective, but of course, from the creativity perspective. That's when you get the insights, and that's when you can actually innovate and thrive in the company.
Yes.
Yeah. Amazing. Well, we're already approaching the last few minutes of today's episode. Maybe it would be wonderful to hear about a bit more in depth about your 3I framework with the inquiry, improvisation, and intuition, and also a bit around how we can ask these questions, because how we frame the questions, I know you did your TEDx on this, framing the question also helps us to frame the solution. That's part of the inquiry process, I guess.
Yeah. So the 3 I's, as you said, they are improvisation, inquiry, and intuition, not necessarily in that order. The whole purpose of the 3I creativity framework is to give people a way to operationalize and activate, toggling between wonder and rigor to solve problems. I also created a card game called the Wonder Rigor Discovery Deck, which through play and question prompts helps people to also think through situationally based on this task that I have to work through, what's the best approach that I might take. So improvisation is something that most of us are terrified to do, because we think of like incredible comedic actors or jazz musicians or rappers, and we think, I can't do that. And what I remind people of is that you actually hack your way through every single day. Probably between breakfast and lunch, you've had to improvise your way through supporting a child, a spouse, a colleague, or a client. So don't downplay your ability to improvise. And we were certainly great at it when we were children, right? So improvisation is about being experimental. It's about the build. It's about being able to say yes and instead of yeah, but, or certainly don't say a flat out no. You just kill everything, right? So this is what improvisation is. And in my book, I give a lot of practical ways to build on those. Inquiry is our ability to frame and reframe questions. I also in Fast Company, my latest article is, I was being a bit provocative, and I called the title of the article is The AI We Didn't See Coming, Artificial Imagination. So not artificial intelligence, but artificial imagination. And what I'm really offering in this article is that rather than having a fear-based perspective about AI and ChatGPT and all these technologies can actually be our collaborators and our kind of co-conspirators as we're working to create their starting place, their catalysts. And certainly for the coder who's designing the algorithms, they need to be able to ask better questions. In fact, there's a whole new job category of prompt engineers, people who can design questions around these technologies. And on the in-use perspective, if you have ever used something like ChatGPT, then you're astutely aware it's only as good as the questions that you ask. So your ability for question framing, developing deep curiosity is really important. And then intuition. Intuition is something I am committed to consistently bringing up, especially in our corporate business environments, because we don't touch intuition in medical school, in business school, or in law school. Yet every single successful leader with whom I've ever worked or interacted with has always brought up the role of intuition in their strategic decision-making process. And as I've already mentioned, intuition is something that is like a muscle or a sonar, so do not ignore it, because the more you pay attention to it, the clearer and stronger it gets. It also means that you must be ambiguous friendly. You must be ambiguous confident. I just led a session with a group last week where I was talking about the value of ambiguity and leaning into ambiguity. And intuition is certainly one of the ways that we can do that.
Wonderful. I mean, such a fantastic framework, and the questions, the inquiry side, the fact that we're all good at improvising, even though we might not be aware of it or not think about it, and the intuition. And most of my work is intuitively based. I don't know what that means. It just means I hear a voice and I do it. That's pretty much it. And so far it's worked pretty well. So yes, love intuition too. Thank you so much, Natalie. This has been an amazing episode. I've loved having you on the show. Such a fascinating topic, so much around creativity and taking that creative leap. Where can people find you?
They can go to figure8thinking.com. That's FIGURE, the number 8thinking.com. And they can access a free sample chapter to my book, The Creativity Leap. They can hire me for speaking engagements, and they can download awesome gifts and guides to help them build their creative capacity. And I'd love them to connect with me on LinkedIn and Instagram.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Natalie.
Thank you so much for having me on your podcast, Katie.